I want you to imagine a reality that, honestly, probably sounds completely impossible today. Seriously. Picture this for a second. Israel and Iran,
Right.
right? Two nations that absolutely dominate modern headlines with
Right.
this intense, openly hostile animosity.
Right.
Imagine them operating as secret, strategic allies. And I don't just mean a neutral, hands-off relationship where they agree to look the other way. I'm talking about active partners,
Yeah, highly
like
active.
trading massive amounts of oil,
Yeah.
sharing really sensitive intelligence, and even providing each other with direct military support.
I mean, it sounds like speculative fiction,
It
honestly.
really does.
But looking at the historical record we have, it is an absolute documented reality. The relationship was actually highly functional and deeply intertwined.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm your host, and joined by our resident geopolitical expert, we are looking at a really comprehensive analytical breakdown of the historical roots of the Israel-Iran conflict. We're going to use this source material to map out exactly how these two nations shifted from being quiet, cooperative partners to locking in to what is, undeniably the most volatile and dangerous rivalry on Earth.
Because understanding that transformation is a prerequisite for making sense of the modern geopolitical landscape. Without understanding the historical mechanics of how we got here, today's headlines are basically just noise.
Exactly. But before we jump in, I want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that the sources we are exploring today touch on some deeply sensitive, complex, and politically charged events.
Very much so.
So our goal for this deep dive is strictly to impartially report on the factual concepts and the history provided in the original analysis. We are not here to endorse any specific political viewpoint or, to take a side.
Right, we are acting as impartial guides through the architecture of this conflict. The underlying mechanics of the history are compelling enough on their own without adding bias.
We are simply following the timeline, the strategies, and the facts as they are laid out.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because discovering this history feels a bit like finding out two famous arch-nemeses used to be college roommates who helped each other with their homework.
That is a great way to put it.
I know it sounds absurd, but it actually happened. So let's start with the era before 1979. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, what did this day-to-day partnership actually look like?
Well, it was defined by intense pragmatic cooperation, which was largely driven by resource and security needs. Under the Shah's leadership, Iran formally recognized Israel.
Wow.
Yeah, and the cooperation was highly tangible. I mean, Israel needed energy to fuel its rapidly growing state, and Iran was this massive oil producer looking for reliable export routes.
This is a perfect match, economically speaking.
Exactly. They even collaborated on physical infrastructure like oil pipelines just to bypass hostile territory.
Huh.
And in return, Israel provided Iran with agricultural expertise, technological support, and advanced military training. We have to look at the map to really understand the why behind this. Israel called this their periphery alliance strategy.
Right, the periphery doctrine.
Yeah. If you are a young Israeli state surrounded by an immediate ring of hostile Arab nations like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, you don't just bunker down.
No, you can't afford to.
You look past those immediate borders to the outer ring. You build strong ties with non-Arab states further out on the periphery to counter the hostile states in the middle.
It is a classic geographical pincer movement. By allying with Iran, Israel essentially forced its Arab adversaries to worry about a powerful, well-armed neighbor to their east.
Which splits their strategic focus.
Exactly, it effectively splits their focus. And Iran shared those exact same concerns. The Shah was deeply threatened by the rising tide of Arab nationalism.
Specifically, the movements looking to topple regional monarchies, right?
Yes. Furthermore, both Israel and Iran were acutely focused on preventing Soviet influence from bleeding into the Middle East during the Cold War.
So they were looking at the exact same geopolitical chessboard.
They were.
But here's the twist from the source material that really highlights how deeply entrenched this pragmatism was. Even after the 1979 Iranian Revolution drastically altered the government in Tehran, Israel still secretly supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
That's crucial detail.
I mean, the revolution happens, the new regime is openly hostile, yet Israel is still funneling secret military support to Iran simply because they calculated that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was the larger, more immediate military threat.
What's fascinating here is that it proves that alliances in the Middle East were once dictated almost entirely by cold, calculated survival and Cold War dynamics rather than unyielding ideology.
Right.
The strategic muscle memory was so strong that it kept a back channel of cooperation open even as the political facade was crumbling.
So let me ask you a question. If that alliance survived, even briefly, into the post-revolution era, strictly out of necessity, doesn't that prove this entire modern conflict is purely constructed?
How do you mean?
Well, it tells me this rivalry is not some permanent, ancient historical fixture. It's a manufactured geopolitical dynamic that could be turned on and off based on immediate needs.
Ah, I see. Well, the conflict was certainly not inevitable, it was built. But while pragmatism kept that back channel open for a fleeting moment, a massive structural earthquake had already occurred within Iran's domestic politics.
The 1979 revolution.
Exactly. The tectonic plates had shifted, making long-term cooperation impossible.
Let's examine that earthquake.
Yeah.
The pivotal year is 1979.
Sure.
The Shah is overthrown and replaced by a theocratic regime led by Ayatollah Khomeini.
Mm-hmm.
And the shift in foreign policy is pretty instantaneous. Overnight, Iran officially cuts all ties. The Israeli embassy in Tehran is shuttered and literally handed over to Palestinian representatives.
It was a very stark, very public pivot.
Israel is suddenly and publicly labeled an enemy of Islam.
And the nature of that label is the crux of the issue. This was not a dispute over a border, water rights, or a trade agreement.
Right, it wasn't logistical.
No. The new theocratic regime viewed Israel not just as a competing nation-state, but as an intolerable symbol of Western influence and a colonial outpost in the Middle East. Opposition to Israel was elevated from a mere policy preference into a foundational pillar of the new Iranian identity.
Okay, I hear you calling this a purely ideological earthquake, but isn't that a bit naive?
How so?
I mean, it feels like overnight the rivalry went from strategic to deeply ideological. But weren't there highly practical, domestic, political reasons for the Ayatollah to suddenly make an enemy of Israel right out of the gate?
There were, absolutely.
When you have a deeply fractured post-revolution country, isn't unifying the public against a common external boogeyman the oldest political trick in the book? But I guess the real question is it fundamentally harder to resolve a conflict when it's suddenly tied to a nation's spiritual and political identity rather than just disputes over borders or resources?
That is the critical nuance.
Mm.
And to answer your question, yes, it is exponentially harder to resolve, but it was absolutely a dual-purpose strategy. Internally, vilifying Israel and the United States provided a powerful unifying narrative to consolidate power among a chaotic post-revolutionary populace.
Makes sense, given a shared enemy.
Precisely. And externally, it served a massive geopolitical function. Iran is a majority Shia, Persian nation situated in a region dominated by majority Sunni Arab nations.
Right.
By taking up the mantle of the most aggressive opponent of Israel, the new Iranian regime was making a bid for leadership over the entire Islamic world, effectively transcending the Sunni-Shia divide.
So it wasn't just blind religious fervor. It was a highly calculated mechanism for regional dominance.
Exactly.
But despite this fierce new ideological hatred, Iran didn't immediately declare an all-out conventional war against Israel. I mean, they didn't mobilize tank battalions and march across the map.
Well, ideology rarely entirely erases the reality of military risk. Direct conventional warfare is incredibly costly, and the new regime was already fighting a brutal, decade-long war with Iraq.
So they didn't have the resources anyway.
Right. Launching a traditional invasion against a militarily superior Israel would have likely resulted in the collapse of the new Iranian government. So they engineered a much more intricate, long-term path.
The strategy of indirect warfare. The creation of the axis of resistance.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the mechanism of how they fight is entirely decentralized. Think of it like a militant franchise business model.
A franchise model is a very apt comparison.
Right. I mean, it's like a chess match where one player uses only pawns to swarm the king, while the other player tries to strike the hand moving the pieces. Iran acts as the corporate headquarters. They provide the startup capital, the overarching brand identity, and the research and development for advanced weaponry.
But they rely entirely on local management to execute the operations and take on the immediate physical risk. The architects in Tehran spent decades funding, training, and arming specific groups. Hezbollah in Lebanon was formed in the 1980s with direct Iranian oversight. Then you have Hamas in Gaza and eventually various armed militias across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen.
And this mechanism allows Iran to pressure Israel on multiple fronts simultaneously. Like a rocket fired from Lebanon or a drone launched from Yemen forces Israel to expend massive resources and keep its military constantly deployed.
It spreads them incredibly thin.
Yeah. Iran expands its regional influence outward, dictating the security environment of the entire Middle East while keeping its own homeland insulated from the devastating costs of a full-scale direct war.
It is the ultimate expression of asymmetric warfare. You surround your opponent with persistent, low-cost threats that constantly drain their resources while you remain safely behind your own borders.
Israel, naturally, developed counter-strategy. The result is what this source material calls the shadow war.
Hmm.
If Iran is using a franchise model to swarm Israel's borders, Israel's strategy has been to violently disrupt the supply chain of that franchise. They conduct continuous aggressive airstrikes in Syria to destroy weapons shipments before they reach Lebanon. And they execute highly targeted assassinations of key Iranian military commanders who coordinate this network.
They also utilize sophisticated cyber warfare to blind or disable Iranian infrastructure. The term shadow war perfectly captures the dynamic.
Because it's all happening just out of plain sight.
Exactly. There are no formal declarations of war, no armies marching under flags, but there are lethal, high-stakes military engagements occurring constantly just beneath the surface of everyday international relations. Both nations have spent decades quietly bleeding each other.
But proxies and supply chain disruptions have limits.
Okay.
You could only harass a nation's borders so much before they strike back at the source.
That's the inherent risk of the strategy.
And the analysis points out that while the shadow war allowed them to fight indirectly, a new technological pursuit was slowly coming into focus that would eventually raise the stakes to a truly existential level.
Right, we have to shift to the early 2000s, which marks the aggressive acceleration of Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, let's get into that.
Officially, Tehran maintains that the pursuit of the nuclear fuel cycle is strictly for peaceful, civilian energy purposes.
But Israel views the mechanics of this completely differently.
Very much so.
From their perspective, Iran is actively funding proxy groups surrounding their borders, and Iranian leadership has openly called for the elimination of the Israeli state. If the nation providing the funding and the weapons to those proxies suddenly acquires a nuclear umbrella, Israel can no longer fight back conventionally without risking nuclear annihilation. A nuclear-armed Iran permanently shifts the balance of power.
Exactly. When a state perceives a threat as entirely existential, meaning the literal survival of the nation is at stake, the calculus of deterrence changes. The risk threshold for preemptive action becomes incredibly high.
And the secret measures taken by Israel and its allies to sabotage the nuclear program demonstrate exactly how high those stakes are. Look at the deployment of the Stuxnet virus.
A fascinating piece of cyber history.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a standard computer hack to steal data. Stuxnet was a malicious, highly complex cyber weapon physically introduced into an air-gapped Iranian nuclear facility.
Meaning it wasn't even connected to the internet.
Right. It infiltrated the industrial control systems and caused the physical centrifuges to spin wildly out of control while simultaneously feeding fake normal data to the monitoring screens.
So the scientists thought everything was fine right up until the machines physically tore themselves apart.
It was a watershed moment in digital warfare, causing massive physical destruction without firing a single bullet.
It really was.
And alongside cyber sabotage and the targeted assassinations of key Iranian nuclear scientists, there is the utilization of the economic weapon. The international community, driven largely by these security concerns, imposed crushing, unprecedented economic sanctions on Iran.
Sanctions that effectively locked Iran out of the global banking system and crippled their ability to sell oil.
Yeah, the financial toll is staggering. The source highlights that it's cost Iran hundreds of billions of dollars in lost revenue and plunged domestic populations into severe economic hardship.
A massive domestic burden.
So what does this all mean? I mean, if the Iranian regime is willing to endure that massive, crushing economic devastation and risk widespread domestic unrest, doesn't that prove their commitment to the nuclear program is essentially unshakable? Is it proof of how deep this ideological goal really goes?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals that the nuclear threshold is viewed as a literal matter of regime survival.
For both of them.
Exactly. For Israel, survival means preventing a sworn enemy from obtaining the ultimate weapon. For Iran, survival and cementing their regional dominance and the legacy of the 1979 revolution means pursuing the capability regardless of the domestic economic cost. They view the nuclear program as the ultimate insurance policy against foreign intervention.
It's an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object.
Pretty much.
And you can only push a shadow war, and existential threats of this magnitude so far before the containment strategies completely fail and the secrecy completely evaporates.
Which brings us to the present dynamic. The conflict is no longer confined to covert sabotage, and it is certainly no longer confined to just two countries. The geography of the confrontation has exploded.
We are looking at a regional power struggle spanning the entire Middle East. In Lebanon, you have Hezbollah directly engaging Israel with daily rocket fire.
Hmm.
In Syria, Iranian military infrastructure faces continuous Israeli bombardment. You have the devastating ongoing conflict with Hamas in Gaza, and you have Iran-backed militias launching drones and ballistic missiles from Iraq and Yemen.
As the map has widened, the fundamental nature of the engagement has transformed. The unwritten rules of the shadow war, where both sides maintained plausible deniability, are deteriorating.
Recent years have seen the secrecy entirely stripped away. We have moved past cyber attacks and proxies. We are now seeing actual direct missile exchanges and drone swarms launched from one sovereign territory directly into the other.
Open kinetic confrontation has replaced covert operations.
Exactly.
This raises an important question. How does the international community manage a conflict that has completely outgrown its covert origins? It is no longer a localized dispute. It is a networked war burning openly across multiple sovereign borders, threatening global trade routes and broader regional stability.
It's honestly like an industrial pressure cooker where the release valve has been taped shut.
That's a good analogy.
The proxy battles and the quiet cyber attacks used to vent some of that pressure, but they've completely failed. The kinetic energy has to go somewhere, and now the lid is finally blowing off in plain sight.
The containment strategies of the past 4 decades are visibly fracturing under the immense pressure.
Distilling all of this analysis down, the deep dive reveals 4 key structural forces driving this massive rivalry. First, the 1979 ideological shift that fundamentally redefined Iran's identity and foreign policy.
Right.
Second, Iran's intricate mechanism of indirect warfare, utilizing the franchise model of the axis of resistance. Third, the high-stakes, existential friction generated by the nuclear threat. And finally, the widening regional battlefield that has dragged the entire Middle East into open confrontation.
Those 4 pillars form the architecture of the current crisis. Understanding how they interlock is really the only way to comprehend the sheer scale of the hostility.
And to you, the listener, this is exactly why understanding the historical mechanics of this conflict is so utterly essential. When you see headlines today about shipping lanes being blocked in the Red Sea or ballistic missiles crossing international airspace, you are watching the culmination of decades of strategic engineering.
It didn't happen overnight.
No, it didn't. You cannot understand the modern Middle East without realizing that this conflict is not ancient, and it was never inevitable. These two fiercely opposed nations, currently locked in an existential struggle, were once quiet partners building oil pipelines together.
History is not a predetermined path. It is actively constructed by geopolitical shifts, calculated strategies, and ideological revolutions.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to ponder on your own. Think back to that impossible reality we started with. If this bitter, deeply existential rivalry was entirely constructed over just a few decades, built on shifting ideologies and pragmatic alliances, could a future geopolitical earthquake eventually deconstruct it just as quickly? Can enemies this deeply entrenched, this structurally opposed, ever find a mechanism to become quiet partners again?